A lot of the media attention around SETI has been on, like, will we get to a two-way conversation with a whale? And in some respects, I think that does a disservice both to the whales and to people. Ultimately, this is a listening project. We want to learn and understand what's so important to whales that they want to talk about it. Can we build models that allow us to predict what's going to happen next based on what we're hearing right now? It doesn't drive me to be a part of the conversation. What is driving me in all of this is if we better understand what matters to them, we can turn around and ask, how are our lives invading their lives? Because ultimately, we very much are. SETI often gets asked, if you can find out a distress call or an alarm call, maybe you can play it in front of ships so that the whales don't get hit. And my answer is, if we know that there's an alarm call or an emergency call that happens when ships are around, then maybe we need to consider how we change our shipping. Right? Rather than just telling the whales to get out of the way.
That is Shane Gero. He's the founder of the Dominica Sperm Whale Project, focused on sperm whale families living in the Eastern Caribbean. He is also the biology lead for Project CETI, applying advanced machine learning and robotics to decipher sperm whale language. And he's a scientist in residence at Carleton University in Ottawa. And those clicks you're hearing right now, that's the sound of sperm whales conversing. They're called codas. Shane Gero is our guest, talking about his efforts to decipher those codas on this episode of Explore, a Canadian Geographic podcast. Welcome to all you explorers out there, armchair and in motion. I'm your host, David McGuffin. It's crunch time, Explore fans. The CanGeo Polar Plunge fundraiser in support of this podcast is happening this Sunday, March 9th, in lakes, rivers, and oceans right across Canada. At this difficult moment in our history, there is no better way to show your Canadian pride than making a donation to help Canadian Geographic tell Canada's story. This episode is a great example of the kind of storytelling we do here on Explore, highlighting the work of incredible Canadians and their efforts to preserve our wild spaces by seeking a better understanding of the wildlife that lives in them. And we've traveled far and wide to do that, to Cambridge Bay and Taloyoak in the Canadian Arctic, to Waskaganish on James Bay, on an icebreaker along our Atlantic coast, and many towns and cities and beautiful places in between, telling unique Canadian stories that help illuminate and define who we are and what our future holds. It's your donations that help make that possible. And donating also gives you a great opportunity to wave the flag in this moment of uncertainty. So please, donate at rcgs.org Polar Plunge 2025 to take part. Donations of $200 or more receive a beautiful branded Compass Rose Canadian Geographic scarf. Thank you so much for your support. And now, on to Shane Gero and cracking the language of the whales.
Shane Gero, welcome to the Explore podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you. And what a fascinating job you have, living in this amazing underwater world of whale language. If you don't mind, I'd like to find out, when I'm talking to our explorers on this podcast, what it is that sparked that sense of adventure, that sense of exploration in their life. So where did you grow up and what were you like as a kid?
I was born and raised in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, which is nowhere near the ocean. But I remember this Canadian book called Paddle to the Sea, about the hand-carved canoe that goes from basically northern Ontario through all the Great Lakes and out into the ocean. And that was like the first sort of realization that, all of these things are connected. And that coincided with the time where I think every kid, sort of no matter where they live in the world, at some time between being 5 and 12, falls in love with something in nature, right? Either because it's amazing or it can do something amazing that we can't do, like flying like a bird or holding your breath like a whale or running through the treetops like a squirrel. Like, kids are just struck with the awe of the natural world. Or you break open stones and there's gems in there, right. And how unbelievable that is. And I think for me, as far as I can remember, my favorite animal was the whale. First, it was the orca on the west coast of Canada, and how important they were to the people there, and just like this spectacular black and white thing. And then eventually more to the sperm whales I work with now.
What was your first whale encounter then? Like when did that happen?
I didn't see a wild whale until I was 22. Like I had started my undergraduate degree. I mean, I saw some animals in captivity and of course like just watched through every documentary, which weren't as easily accessible as they are now. Yeah. I was passionate about the oceans quite quickly. I had a cup in the kitchen that had all these sea animals on, and that's the only cup I would drink out of. Like I was pretty sold early on. And awesome. I had, the huge privilege of having parents that supported me all through this in terms of like the crazy things I wanted to do for camp or like these things I wanted to do as experiments in my backyard, that kind of thing. And that, in Canada, there were world experts at the university level who studied whales. Yeah. And that's how this sort of adventure really got started.
Did your parents have any connection to the ocean, or is this just coming out of nowhere?
No, I mean, my dad is a diplomat and my mom was a social worker, and I bring those tools of like finding consensus and understanding what's important to others to bear when it comes to trying to understand whales. But no, like, we weren't sailors. We didn't own a boat.
No. Were there any island postings or anything like that with the diplomatic career?
No. It was Switzerland. It was the heart of diplomacy. Yeah. My dad was, on the economic side, like the World Trade Organization. So, no. Yeah.
Fascinating. So where was that first whale that you saw?
I saw a southern right whale. I went to do field work for my honors degree in Western Australia, and we saw them there. And then I worked with a community of dolphins that's a part of a very famous wild dolphin project over there called the Dolphins of Monkey Maya Research Program. For me, the 7-year-old kid, that was success then,
Yeah.
That we were out there taking pictures and following the lives of the dolphins. On the
oh my God, yeah. If 7-year-old you could see you doing that. Yeah, right. Like,
yeah.
I mean,
the 7-year-old me was pretty excited when I moved to Halifax and the ocean was accessible. My 7-year-old self would be pretty excited about where I am today, for sure.
Let's talk about where you are now. We were looking at finding a date to do an interview, and you were in Dominica last week.
Yeah.
Working with your whales. What was happening there?
I was in Dominica mostly for meetings on the conservation and sustainable economy development that's going on in Dominica. But the whales are out there every day. I started following the lives of the families of sperm whales in the Eastern Caribbean in 2005. And they say it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert at something. And we're about 6,000 hours of time with sperm whales there.
Wow.
And so we've really come to know them as individuals, as members and families, as this sort of multicultural community in the Eastern Caribbean. And that's been sort of unthinkable from where we were when we started this 20 years ago. I'd love to tell you it was my skill as a biologist, but we also just found a community of whales that doesn't roam quite as far, despite being ocean nomads, that spends a lot of time off given islands. And it seems that's because their grandmother's grandmother preferred that island rather than the ecosystem around them. And so we can see the same whale this week as next month, as next year. And that allows us to follow in their lives in a way we couldn't before. So Dominica is a pretty special place.
It sounds amazing. Yeah. It's down in the Caribbean, obviously. And it's so doing my little bit of research on this, and I didn't realize Moby Dick was a sperm whale, right? So that's the most famous sperm whale of all.
Well, I hope one day that someone like Fingers or Lady Oracle or now Rounder and her baby, eclipse Moby Dick. But yeah, I mean, sperm whales have been important to human society and culture too. They powered our industry before we really got fossil fuels up and firing. We used to hunt them for oil, to lubricate machinery, to power furnaces, to make candles, to all of these things. And so they were a part of our culture. The whalers were these amazing ocean heroes. They were hunted by monsters like Moby Dick. Some scholars think the biblical Leviathan was a sperm whale. So that is the sort of original monster in some senses. But that's always being clouded by our filter of our experience with them, not who they actually are. Yeah. And I think that's where the animals that I work with in Dominica are being far better ambassadors to human society about what it means to be a sperm whale and who they really are.
back then, I mean, we were hunting them, obviously, so there was a reason for aggression on their part. But they were sinking ships. They were sinking ships, though, right? Like,
yeah, well, I mean, I think what would anyone's response be when someone is trying to kill their entire family? You know, we decimated sperm whales. You know, in fact, you know, we've been killing whales for centuries. Now we do it mostly out of ignorance through hitting them with ship or entangling them in our fishing gear. But there we were being very intentional to take as many as we can. The bigger ones, the better. And so, yeah, it led to all this amazing lore about how dangerous and monstrous they were, because they were huge. I mean, this is an animal that's like the length of 2 school buses and weighs as much as 10 of them. And many of these men were in small rowboats shooting them with harpoons. Like, I can only imagine how terrifying it must have been.
But your experience obviously is a 180 from that, right?
Yeah, so sperm whales live in families that are quite small in the Caribbean, only about 7 animals, and it'll be grandmothers, mothers, and daughters who live together for life, you know, communally raising and defending their calves. And these are gentle giants in many ways. Firstly, they know that they can hold their breath and go deeper than anything at the surface. Yeah. So if they want to get away, they just disappear into the vast darkness that is the open ocean in the deep.
Like kilometers deep, right? Like unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, we see dives over 1 kilometer down on a regular basis. Some of the records for sperm whales get close to 2 kilometers. So these are very, very deep divers. I mean, some of the deepest and longest divers of any mammal that we know. You know, they can hold their breath for over an hour. You know, they're diving deeper than most modern nuclear attack submarines. Wow. So, you know, there are very few submarines in the world, actually, that can consistently go deeper than sperm whales do every hour. So they're this marvel of the ocean world. Their lives are very inwardly focused about raising their family, being good neighbors. Apparently, they seem to converse with each other on a regular basis. One of the things that I've always been fascinating as I sat there on a small sailboat or a motorboat recording the whales is, you know, so much of their energy is spent making noise at each other. You know, what is all that for? You know, we've started following the lives of babies as they grow older and they learn their natal dialect, because not every family sounds the same. And we've watched the mature males grow older, become teenagers, and leave the families. And we thought initially that it was sort of, you know, very testosterone walkabout, like they became teenagers and sort of raged off in search of mates. But actually, it's quite sad. You know, this is an animal that spends probably 15 years in this hyper-social family, very supportive by its aunts and cousins and sisters. And then one day, mom has a new baby, and the male is essentially just socially ostracized and isn't sort of allowed in the family anymore. And it's sad. They'll follow the family around sometimes for 2 or 3 years, kind of on its own, a few kilometers away, not wanting to leave. And my dad was really funny. He was like, you know, that's like dropping your kids off at university. Yeah. Right? And they've been in this family that's had supportive parents, and maybe the grandmothers are living in the same house. Yeah. And then suddenly they're just kind of on their own. Yeah. You know, and what that shift must be for a young male sperm whale, we don't really know, because they travel so far. Males will cross oceans and, you know, go from pole to pole. So studying the males after they leave their families is really, really hard. Huh. But it paints this really rich picture of this really, you know, strong and complicated community, this sort of rich life just on the opposite side of the surface from us. Anytime we look, we find these amazing things that are fundamentally different, but surprisingly not so dissimilar, right?
So let's crack into some of that, right? So Project CETI, which is what you're working on, it's trying to crack their language, basically, right? When we were emailing back and forth, I made the mistake of describing it as a song, but that's the humpback whale, of course, which is famous for its singing. But this is quite different, isn't it? Can you describe?
Yeah, absolutely. Unsurprisingly, every species of animal sounds different, right? Mm. And we use the word song when it comes to humpback whales. But for sperm whales, we talk about codas. So these are rhythmic patterns of clicks, kind of like Morse code for the older folks listening, where they're clicks with different spacing between them. And any sperm whale family might use 20 to 30 different rhythms. So one might be click, 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 click. That's what we call the 1 + 1 + 3. Or one might be click, 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 which is just 4 regularly spaced clicks. So we would call that a 4R. So that's just the rhythm. But then they vary the tempo. So some 1 + 1 + 3 might be click, 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 click. And another might be click, 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 click. So it's the same rhythm, but a slower tempo. And so they have these sort of component parts, rhythm, tempo, something we called ornamentation, which is where they add an extra click on the end. And they can sort of bring these together in different combinations to make different codas that they then exchange in long sequences. So 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 animals will make codas back and forth at each other across minutes, right? Sometimes when they're socializing, when the whole family comes together and will roll around and play with each other, they'll make codas for half an hour or more. What is that about? Is sort of what CETI is asking itself, right? Is if we take, not only what they're saying and how often they say it, right? But we figure out who's saying it, where they are, what they're doing, who they're with, then we can start asking the question of why. Like, what's so important to a sperm whale that they want to make sounds at each other? Is it about social bonding? Is it about group decision making? What are they encoding information, or is it just about influencing each other to do different behaviors? These are the sort of outstanding questions. And Project CETI takes this step of saying, we need to find new ways to record the ocean to get large amounts of data and then apply these modern machine learning models to sort of draw lines between these things. Ultimately, whether you call it AI or neural networks or machine learning, these are just really good pattern findings. Software, right? Like, so if this happens, then this will happen later. Or we can make predictions about what will happen based on the 4 things we just had. That's essentially what we're talking about here. And when you take the audio and overlap that with the behavior and the social information of this is a grandmother and a granddaughter in a conversation, and we know that they're doing it in deep water, or they're doing it after being full, or then you can start finding patterns of what does the world look like when we're able to listen to sperm whales and predict what's going to happen next, or what might get said next. And that's what we mean when we say we're trying to decode what sperm whales are saying.
So AI is kind of like your Rosetta Stone.
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things. One is that machine learning is just really, really powerful tool for the work that we do. Mm-hmm. So it used to be if we recorded, let's say, a minute, it would take us 8 to 12 minutes just to extract the audio, to listen to it, to click on where all the sounds are, to say these 4 clicks are from one whale and those 4 clicks are from another whale. Automating that through neural networks is taking us a big step forward. So now if we're going to record 1,000 hours a month, we don't have to have a horde of researchers and graduate students processing all that audio, taking forever, right? So from an applied perspective of detection, is there a sound there? Annotation, do these sounds go together? Localization, where did that sound come from? And identification, who made that sound, whether we're able to take that picture. Automating that through these novel methods is going to be a huge asset, and already is. And then there's this bigger question of, can we use these large models to try and interpret what is going on here, right? Yeah. And that's where we get to predictive models. So if we hear 8 seconds of codas, can we predict the next 8? If we hear 10 seconds of codas, can we predict the behavior that the whale's going to do next? Is it going to start diving? Is it going to turn farther offshore? And that's where I think we get at this idea of sort of a one-way decoding, right? Like, can we understand what the sound's function is by predicting what happens after you hear it? And the answer so far is that it's not so clean, in that it's not this, when you hear sound A, B happens. Right. In fact, the models we're working on now show that there's much more complexity than that. And you can't look at it as a one-on-one. You have to look at these exchanges in context across time before you get good at predicting what might happen next.
I mean, you mentioned 1 + 1 + 3, which, I mean, you've discovered is almost entirely unique to to your particular group of whales down there, right? And what have you learned about that?
Well, so I think a lot of the work with sperm whales and many species around the world has been to document the sort of collection of all sounds they might make, and say how frequently they're made, right? And when Luke Rendell and Hal Whitehead, who I did my PhD with out of Dalhousie University in Halifax, did that in the late 90s into the early 2000s, that's where they showed that these families of whales make these sets of codas, and those families of whales make different rhythms and speak different codas. And when you look at that, you could see that animals that sound the same will spend time together, and animals that don't sound the same will not. And there's this social divide that is basically labeled by the sounds that they make. And more recent work that we did really puts that on the nose and says that, these codas are identity codas, and they likely function as markers of, what essentially are cultural groups, like our ethnic groups.
Yeah,
very much that it's like I am Canadian, not just the difference between truck and lorry, between UK English and Canadian English, right?
Yeah.
There's a difference there. It's not just something that allows us... You hear lorry, they're British.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that the word truck is a part of Canadians' identity nationally, right? Whereas I am Canadian is.
Do you have a sense if the differences are as much as, say, between French and English, when you're talking about the different dialects? Or, can they understand each other? Are we at that
That's
point
such a great question.
Yeah.
And the one that prompted me to think about this was we would have big males come in to mate with the families. And in the Caribbean, that identity coda is the 1 + 1 + 3, right? It's unique to the animals in the Eastern Caribbean clan. And so the question was, how do the males know who they're with, and how do the females know the males if they don't make the same coda types?
Right.
And so we partnered with a huge number of sperm whale biologists all around the world to start something called the Global Coda Dialect Project. And selfishly, one of the reasons was I want to have the repertoire of codas from all over the world so that when a male shows up in Dominica, I can go, oh, you're from Sri Lanka, right?
Cool. Yeah.
But what it has done in the process is build this amazing sort of ethno-geographic map. Like, where do we hear which clans in which oceans? And that's really powerful, because what that gives us is a much better sort of underpinning to restructure large-scale conservation policy, right? Because we know that the whales here in the Eastern Caribbean, off Dominica, make a specific dialect. They have different movement habits, different habitat use, different diet, right? And we know from other work that clans succeed and fail differently under stress, right? So the regular clan does well in the Galapagos during El Nino, but the +1 doesn't, right? And so the stressors that we put on these clans, these cultural groups, lead to different success and failure. So if we're going to conserve them, we need to think about cultural diversity as a part of biodiversity, right? By using this map of Canadians are different from French, are different from Ghanese, are different from Chinese, are different from Japanese people, right? And those differences aren't in the genetics of humans. They're in the culture, right? And that's what we're saying about sperm whales too. So if we pivot our conservation towards recognizing the differences that the animals are seemingly recognizing in themselves, then we have a really powerful way of increasing our ability to protect these whales.
These are highly intelligent animals, right?
I mean, as far as we know, it's the largest physical brain ever to exist in the universe, right?
Right.
And the far better scientists than I who study brains and the cells that are there and how complex and structurally and physically the brains are, suggest that this is not a brain that's there just to be a hot part of your body. This is a brain that has evolved for complex cognition. But studying thought in other animals is really tough.
Yeah. Yeah.
But for everything that we know, I think we can safely assume that these are animals that have complex cognition and are, therefore not just responding to stimulus if it's a red light stop, if it's a green light go.
Yeah.
I think there's more going on there. And when you spend a huge amount of time with them, you see it. We had these amazing animals, especially at the beginning of the study, where they sort of noticed this boat was around all the time. They noticed that we did the same thing over and over and over again, right? Because that's what good scientists do.
Right.
And when they would dive, when they lift their tail, making a deep dive, that sort of quintessential whale watch moment, we take a photo ID, we photograph them. That's how we tell them apart. Their tails are like a thumbprint, right? And then they disappear, and we would go up to the fluke print, which is that sort of calm circle of where the whale just was. And we collect feces and we collect skin, and then we record. And, this one whale especially, can opener, realized that. And she would fake dives and wait for us. Yeah. Right? And then she would roll her eye out of the water. She would never echolocate on the boat. She wouldn't use her sonar to look at the boat. She would use her eye to look at the now 5-6 biologists who are screaming with excitement that a whale is looking at them. On board is the interesting part. And to me, that shows, there's something new in my environment. I can see the pattern that it's doing. I'm going to make the expectation that if I move, it's going to go up to where I just was, future planning. And then I'm not going to echolocate on the boat. I'm going to look at the things that are moving and making noise. To me, that shows a level of cognition that scientifically, as a scientist, we can't do studies on yet. But it does drive the way we ask questions in our science. Proving thought and internal narrative and that kind of thing is next to impossible in animals. So how do we make science that assumes those things to be true? Because if we limit ourselves to science waiting for those things to be shown, we're going to be waiting a long time,
I kind of want to know what it's like to make eye contact with a whale.
It alters your perception of the world. Yeah. Right? I mean, in the same way that when astronauts go to space and look back at the blue dot, or primatologists, or even, tourists go and see the gorillas in Rwanda, for example. Yeah. It's hard then to not increase the definition of us to include all these animals, right? Yeah. And that there's so much going on. When you see a killer whale carry its dead baby for days, it's hard not to define that as grief. Yeah. And if there's grief, there's love and all the other things that go with it. But how do we do science that shows that? What would be different in the science that we do if we expect those processes to be ongoing? That's an interesting thought.
Very true. You talk about grief too, and you got to witness the birth of a whale. This is the opposite of grief, obviously. Can you just describe that?
She's alive. She's alive. Oh my god.
Oh my god.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
Oh my god.
Yeah!
I mean, it's so hard to. For now, there's a little bit on social media that I hope you go and see. Soon we'll be publishing some science on all of our analyses of the birth, and there'll be more video and audio out there so people can see. But I mean, this is a family we had known for, since the mother was born.
Yeah. So give us their names.
So this was in a family called Unit A. Many of the elders in this family are named after Margaret Atwood characters, actually. So, awesome. Because we were reading one of my favorites of hers, Oryx and Crake, on the boat when we met them for the first time. And so there's actually a whale named Atwood and another female named Lady Oracle, which is also a character. And then she had a baby named Rounder, which got based on the physical name, look of the animal. That animal, which we've known since she was little and still nursing, is now an adult female, and she had a baby right next to our boat. Yeah. And it was kind of unbelievable. We sort of showed up in the early morning, and we found the whales, and they were kind of being strange. Like, they were all together, but nothing really was happening. They were just kind of lying there. But we had seen pilot whales earlier that morning, and we know that pilot whales sometimes harass sperm whales. So maybe they were just being quiet to sort of not be noticed. But it was definitely weird. And then, about half an hour after us just sitting beside them, we started seeing stuff in the water, which at first I thought was fecal, like feces clouds, right? Because when sperm whales poop, it's not big turds. Like, that's a big question that kids love to ask, right? It's like clouds. But actually what it was the beginning of birth, and there was blood. And then when it was clear that there was blood in the water, my first thought was, oh, the pilot whales have showed up and we didn't notice. But then this tiny little sort of buoyant, tiny little body, although it was probably over 3 meters long and a metric ton, was sort of bobbing up and out of the water. Like, it didn't really know where the surface was, because it clearly had poor control over its buoyancy. But all the females are rolling underneath it and lifting it out of the water and pushing it around and sort of competing to be next to it, for hours. And at this point, our boats had been off for half an hour. We're just recording, thankfully we had the recorders underwater running. We had 2 drones in the air recording all of it.
Yeah.
They've only been, sperm whale births have only been seen about 3 times in the last 60 years. So to do that, for that to happen with all of the science systems out, was pretty remarkable. And personally, it was like, such a huge gift. It was sort of emotional to be there because we followed the lives of so many of these little whales across time, but we've never been there to see it happen. And this sort of supportive, highly active, super vocal, they're just making so many codas. And it gives us a really interesting look now because we have this really specific context of what was happening. We can quantify it with, drones in the air and sound underwater. So it's going to be really interesting to see what comes out of all of that.
Can you describe those codas as that?
So they are obviously making a bunch of 1+1+3s, sort of reinforcing who they are and where they come from. But the rate of codas and the amount of codas and the pivoting of those codas in relation to the behavior that we're seeing is where our science is going right now. Can we see when there are shifts in behavior? Because then the pilot whales show up, right? And they start surrounding the sperm whales with the newborn hidden in the middle. So that got very tense. Everyone on the boat was sort of on team sperm whale for that one for sure. But eventually the pilot whales kind of gave up, and then the sperm whales went back to being more relaxed, and the baby at that point was swimming on its own. And I mean, it was an unbelievable 8 hours. Such an honor. It just speaks also to how we do our science, that we were so not a factor. I mean, literally the baby was born within 50 meters of the boat. And then they swam right up alongside the boat, lifting the baby out of the water and around and off. I mean, it was incredible. A huge privilege to be there.
So I'm like a big science fiction fan. And so I think of movies like Close Encounters or Arrival, which are all about interspecies interaction and communication.
Yeah.
But both of those really were about how do we talk back? Like, how do we make a conversation happen? And I'm wondering where you are on that.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of the media attention around SETI has been on, like, will we get to a 2-way conversation with a whale? And in some respects, I think that does a disservice both to the whales and to people, in that, like, ultimately this is a listening project. We want to learn and understand what's so important to whales that they want to talk about it. Can we build models that allow us to predict what's going to happen next based on what we're hearing right now? But I mean, it doesn't drive me to be a part of the conversation. I think what is driving me in all of this is if we better understand what matters to them, we can turn around and ask, how are our lives invading their lives? Because ultimately we very much are. SETI often gets asked, if you can find out a distress call or an alarm call, maybe you can play it in front of ships so that the whales don't get hit. And my answer is, if we know that there's an alarm call or an emergency call that happens when ships are around, then maybe we need to consider how we change our shipping, right? Rather than just telling the whales to get out of the way. And I think that's fundamentally the big take home that I'm most interested in. Spending a huge amount of time with sperm whales, even before SETI, the amazing, but I guess not surprising part of it was, we can talk about the importance of cultural diversity. And because I'm standing in front of a picture of a sperm whale, everyone acknowledges how important their grandmother is to them and the way of life that they've learned from the generations in their family, and that's important to them and they want to protect it, right? But a politician in the same neighborhood talking about the importance of multiculturalism in their society has a harder time of having that conversation, right? And I think the big message from SETI is that, listening to someone so different from us about what's so important to them should ask us, like, how are we going to change our lives now that we've learned that? And so for me, the concept of having a two-way conversation with whales isn't the goal. For me, I think there's so much for us to learn from someone so different from us if we just bother to listen for long enough. And that's great. I mean, talking about the science at some point of like, what does an interactive playback experiment look like is really exciting. But I think we have so much we can still do to understand sperm whales, humpback whales, birds, cheetahs, everybody, all of these animals before we have to think about anything as elegant as that.
So we were talking a bit at the start about, obviously they were almost extinct because of whaling, and we stopped that, it seems, just in time for climate change to start hammering them and microplastics or whatever else.
Yeah.
What is the population like now? What are their challenges?
So globally, there's about 800,000 or just over 800,000 sperm whales worldwide. That's the best number. And that's a big number, right? I mean, there are populations of whales in Canadian waters where there's less than, 300 or 400, like the North Atlantic right whale, right? That comes up into the Gulf of Maine and Nova Scotia. But we think that number used to be over 2.5 million, right? And these are animals that are doing important things from our perspective too of humans, right? These are animals that are mixing nutrients by eating down deep and then defecating at the surface and creating this massive carbon sink that fights climate change on our behalf. So if you kill 3/4 to 4/5 of that, that's not good for us, regardless of how you feel about it for the whales. But we've all but stopped directed hunts on sperm whales. There are still some that happen. But mostly now they're impacted by our presence in the ocean, whether it's literal physical presence through us being there and moving ships across the ocean or putting fishing gear in that they get entangled, or through our presence by our leftovers in terms of, most sperm whales or any whale that washes ashore these days dead is usually filled with plastics. And we don't mean microplastics that we can't see that are hidden in the water. I mean like large plastic bags or chunks of plastic in the oceans. And it's often one of those things about, well, if they're so smart and they have this great sensor system of the most powerful natural sonar system in their nose, how come they're eating so much plastic? And the answer I always give back is, it's not that they can't tell, it's that it's everywhere. That's hard. In the same way that if you don't live near the dump, you don't know how huge and terrible the dump actually is. And that's why it's like part of the narrative of talking to people about how amazing these sperm whales are, and that most of the threats are derivatives of human society, is to not let anyone be ignorant to this happening, right? There's someone who's living a rich, complicated life that you don't see every day while we're on, social media or streaming movies or whatever amazing human thing that we're doing in an airplane. But their lives go on in parallel all the time. These animals that we talked about, Rounder's out there with the newborn right now, doing something, avoiding plastics, trying not to get hit by a ship. And we can change a lot of that if we choose to.
I mean, I'm sure people ask you all the time, what can we do? I mean, what can we do on an individual level?
Yeah. Well, sometimes I think often with conservation and climate change, it's often phrased at, well, what can I do as an individual?
Yeah.
And everyone can make good choices about plastics.
Right.
But really what we need to look for is systematic level changes around industry and government. And that everyone can do. So the ocean needs business people, it needs lawyers, it needs taxi drivers, it needs the person who changes the signage for ads in the bus stops. Like, it needs all of those people to say, there are many priorities about human society, but one of my priorities is keeping track of how we interact with the world's oceans. And that's the big one, right? Being engaged in those issues, whether it's at a community level with like a naturalist society, or whether it's literally about calling your representative, because they do keep track of those things. But that's where I like to focus that question is, yes, we can make individual decisions about our behavior around what food we eat or how we get our food or what it's wrapped in. Absolutely. And we've talked a lot about that. But then we need to bring people together to be a bigger definition of us and that expects change. That's key. You know, it wasn't so long ago that Time's most important person of the year or whatever was a climate change activist. We can refocus our story on that.
What brings you hope when you're doing this work?
So much. I mean, look, we just had a bit of a doom and gloom conversation there.
Yeah.
But the animals are still out there and they're still living happy lives, right? Mm-hmm. And it seems like their population decline has stayed somewhat in the last number of years. Mm-hmm. So all sorts of things, but also like going to talk to people about their lives and how it still amazes them. That 7-year-old kid who's amazed by nature is still in everybody, right? And they are awe-inspiring. And I think, you know, I've had a huge gift and privilege to spend a huge amount of time with the whales. And with that, I take the burden of their trust to do something about it. And part of that is talking to people from kindergarten classes to podcasts about who they are, because then it's harder to ignore them. So many things. The little things from going back and seeing the babies get older, hearing a new coda that we haven't heard before, working now. You know, Project CETI has brought together roboticists and computer scientists and linguists on a boat in the ocean following sperm whales around. Yeah. And it's been remarkable to see someone who was like, I'm going to go do an engineering degree and then get a job at some amazing robotics place that's going to build this amazing thing, get on a boat and be like, oh, like I can apply these skills to something amazing that might protect the world's oceans or do something great for fingers. Even the computer scientists and the engineers on the boat during the birth understood how huge it was to be there when this happened. People's perceptions can really be changed when you talk about these things. So yeah, I'm definitely hopeful.
Yeah. That's a big theme on this podcast generally. It's just bringing people face to face with nature just changes everything.
Yeah, and part of it is because our society is so detached. You know, one of the things that's amazing when I fly from Dominica back to Canada is just how few trees. And I live in like a neighborhood that's quite treed, you know, but our disconnection is so real, right? And especially growing up in Ottawa, it felt like I was miles from the ocean until I read Paddle to the Sea. And I realized, well, actually, if I just go down to the canal, all of that water is ocean water eventually. We now more than ever, we need a reminder that we're not so distant and different from things far away from us.
Just to circle back a bit, does Margaret Atwood know she has a pod of whales named after?
I have reached out. I sent a letter and a picture years and years ago. I would love to give her a picture of the animal name Atwood. When we gave them all these names, importantly about the names, people often ask about the nicknames. We don't do that lightly. Like some of them have silly names because we never thought they would be on the Canadian Geographic podcast or the cover of a magazine or whatever, right? And they were nicknames that helped us remember them. Oh, it was the one, you know, that has the 2 fingers that makes it look like the peace sign. And then she just became Fingers. Or it was the one where we were eating the fruit salad this morning at 9 a.m., remember? Okay, then she becomes Fruit Salad. So the names seem flippant initially, but they make a really important point that everyone gets immediately. Yeah. That Fingers is not replaceable by Fruit Salad, right? That when Fingers dies, the animals that know her are going to be impacted. You can't just replace her with some animal from Sri Lanka or an animal from another family or an animal with another name. They're different and unique and important. And the shorthand work that using names for these whales does to make that point is really powerful. And so, yeah, I'd love to thank Margaret Atwood.
But she's a fellow and very involved with the Canadian Geographic Society.
Oh my God! If that
can
be
make
enabled,
something happen,
even just by mail, where I drop something off with a thank you letter and a picture of the whale, that would be very cool.
We could probably make that work. Yeah. Before I let you go, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. I'm going to pull you out of the Caribbean now, but what's their favorite place? Can you describe your favorite place in Canada?
So I'm going to connect this a little bit to the whales, so I'm sorry for that.
That's okay.
But I grew up in Ottawa. My wife grew up in Ottawa. 2 out of the 3 of my kids were born here in Ottawa. And we moved back in part because this is where all the grandmothers were. And in part of that was learning a broader lesson from what's important to sperm whales, right? That family is critical to survival, and if it takes a village. And so, Ottawa, if that's too big an area, but certainly the neighborhood in which my wife and I grew up, has been sort of this consistent part of my existence, despite the travel for academia, despite going and living on a boat. So I would say that if I had to give something more specific, I would say the harbor of in Halifax, because the very first time I got on an ocean going sailboat was in the middle of the night, having zero offshore sailing experience, and going out to do research with my PhD supervisor, and we were offshore for a month. Wow. But then we came home during Hurricane Juan, which was that rare first hurricane that hit Halifax in 2003. And the idea of being on a small boat in the big ocean and realizing, that there's 360-degree horizon and this storm is coming, and getting back to see Chebucto Head and Halifax Harbor, sort of the human world after leaving the whale world behind, was a pretty good feeling of making it home safe. Yeah.
It's that moment again of nature making us humble.
Yeah, totally.
Awesome. Well, listen, Shane, Gero, thank you so much for coming on the Explore podcast.
Oh my God, it's my great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thanks to all of you for listening. It's a real joy for me to be here every 2 weeks with you doing these interviews. If you enjoyed this episode and this podcast, please donate to the Can Geopolar Plunge. It's happening on March 9th in rivers, lakes, and oceans right across Canada. You can show your Canadian pride by helping this podcast tell Canada's stories with interviews like the one you just listened to. And thank you. We literally could not do this without you. Until next time, when we'll explore again. I'm David McGuffin.
I think right now we're enjoying very much looking back at the Earth, and it's just a fantastic experience, and I just can't wait to get back and start telling people.
We left Simpson about June 10th with the Fur Brigade, consisting of a number of yacht boats, each manned by 10 voyageurs.
For us Inuit, it means that Inuit oral history is very strong.
We flew low over every inch of the country that could be. We were hoping that he would fire at us.
I guess 160 dives or so. There are shrimp,